Hello there, dear friend. Before we begin this peaceful journey together, I want to know a little about you. How has your day been? Whether it's been filled with joy or challenges, busy moments or quiet pauses, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling in for the night, taking a midday rest, or perhaps greeting the early morning hours? Wherever you are, from the bustling cities of New York to the quiet countryside of England, from the mountains of Colorado to the shores of Australia, you're welcome here in this sacred space. If this story brings you peace, I'd love for you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber, where we gather each week to find rest in timeless tales of faith, hope, and gentle grace. Now, let's begin. Take a deep breath with me. Let your shoulders soften, your jaw relax, and your heart settle into this moment. Whether morning light is streaming through your window, afternoon shadows are dancing on the walls, or midnight quiet surrounds you like a gentle blanket, let us walk together through a story of gentle strength and unseen grace. We're about to enter a time long ago during the days of the judges in ancient Israel. It was a time of chaos and uncertainty, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. But this is not a story of chaos. This is a story of peace, of quiet faithfulness, of love that chooses to remain when it would be easier to leave. This is the story of Ruth, a young woman whose loyalty would echo through generations and whose humble heart would become part of the greatest story ever told. So close your eyes if you wish, breathe slowly, and let us journey together to the ancient land of Moab, where our story begins beside still waters of the soul. In the rolling hills of Moab, where the morning mist clung to the barley fields like a gentle prayer, lived a young woman named Ruth. She had married into a Hebrew family who had come to Moab during a time of famine in their homeland of Bethlehem. Her husband's name was Mahlon, and his mother was Naomi, a woman whose very name meant pleasant, and whose heart had once been full of joy. But sorrow has a way of finding us, even in the most peaceful places. First, Naomi's husband Elimelech died, leaving her alone with her 2 sons in a foreign land. The boys had grown into men and married Moabite women, Ruth and her sister-in-law Orpah. For 10 years they lived together, and Ruth learned to love not just her husband, but his faith, his God, and especially his mother, who had welcomed her with open arms. Then tragedy struck again, swift and merciless. Both Mahlon and his brother Shilean died, leaving 3 widows to face an uncertain world alone. In those days, a woman without a husband or sons had little hope of survival. They were vulnerable, forgotten, with no one to provide for them or protect them. Naomi sat in her small house, looking at the 2 young women who had become like daughters to her. The silence was heavy with grief, but also with decision. She had heard news from Bethlehem that the famine there had ended, that the Lord had visited his people and given them bread. Her heart longed for home, for the familiar hills of Judah, for the place where she had known happiness before sorrow came calling. "My daughters," she said softly, her voice worn thin by weeping, "I must return to my people. But you are young. You have your whole lives ahead of you. Go back to your mother's houses. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me." She kissed them both, and they wept together. How can you say goodbye to someone who has been your family, your comfort, your companion through the darkest days? Orpah, after much tears and embracing, finally agreed to return to her people and her gods. It was the practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that made sense to everyone around them. But Ruth clung to Naomi with a determination that surprised them all. When Naomi urged her again to follow her sister-in-law, Ruth spoke words that would echo through history, words that came from the deepest place in her heart. "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." There was something in Ruth's voice that told Naomi this was not a decision made in the heat of emotion, but a choice carved in stone, written in the very fibre of her being. This young Moabite woman was choosing love over security, faithfulness over comfort, an unknown future over a predictable past. And so they began the long journey from Moab to Bethlehem, two women with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the strength of their love for each other. They walked through valleys where wildflowers nodded in the breeze, past streams that sang ancient songs, under skies that seemed to stretch endlessly toward hope. As they travelled, Ruth would gather berries and herbs along the way, always making sure Naomi had enough to eat. She would find the softest spot for them to rest each night, would share her cloak when the desert air grew cold. She had chosen this path, and she would walk it with grace and dignity, one step at a time. The journey took many days, and with each step toward Bethlehem, Ruth was walking further from everything she had ever known. She was leaving behind the gods of her childhood, the customs of her people, the language of her birth. She was choosing to become a stranger in a strange land, not because she had to, but because love had made the choice for her. When they finally crested the hill that overlooked Bethlehem, the city spread before them like a handful of pearls scattered on brown velvet. The sun was setting, painting the stone houses in shades of gold and amber. Smoke rose from evening fires, and the sound of children playing drifted up to them on the evening breeze. "Look," Naomi whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "There it is, home." But as they descended into the city, the women who had known Naomi in her happier days barely recognized her. "Is this Naomi?" they asked each other, seeing how sorrow had aged her, how loss had bent her shoulders and silvered her hair. "Do not call me Naomi," she told them, her voice steady but sad. "Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home empty." But Ruth, standing quietly beside her, knew that Naomi was not truly empty. She had brought with her the love of this young woman, who had chosen to forsake all for the sake of faithfulness. And though neither of them knew it yet, they had arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest, when the fields were golden and ready, when provision was about to unfold in ways they could never have imagined. The story was just beginning, and the God who notices every sparrow that falls, who counts every tear that is shed, who remembers every act of kindness, was already preparing the next chapter of their lives. The morning air in Bethlehem was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of ripening grain and the promise of a new day. Ruth woke early, as she always did, listening to the gentle rhythm of Naomi's breathing beside her. They had found a small place to stay, but their provisions were nearly gone, and Ruth knew that something had to be done. She'd heard about the law of gleaning, a beautiful provision that the God of Israel had made for the poor and the stranger. After the reapers went through the fields harvesting the grain, the needy could follow behind and gather what was left. It was honest work, humble work, but it was work that could keep them alive. "Let me go to the fields," Ruth said gently to Naomi, "and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favour." Naomi nodded, understanding the necessity but also the risk. Ruth was young and beautiful, and the fields could be dangerous places for a woman alone. But there was something in Ruth's quiet determination that spoke of inner strength, of a spirit that could not be easily broken. And so Ruth set out in the early morning light, joining the other gleaners who moved like shadows behind the harvest workers. She had wrapped her head modestly and carried a small basket, ready to spend the day bent over in the sun, gathering grain kernel by kernel. As it happened, she came to the field that belonged to Boaz, a man of great wealth and standing in Bethlehem. But more than that, though Ruth did not know it yet, Boaz was a relative of Naomi's late husband, a kinsman who had the right and responsibility to help family members in need. The phrase, "as it happened," seems simple enough, but sometimes the most profound movements of providence come disguised as coincidence. Ruth's feet carried her to that particular field not by accident, but by the gentle guidance of a God who was weaving a story larger than she could imagine. Boaz arrived at his field that morning, as was his custom, to greet his workers and oversee the harvest. He was a man in his middle years, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. When he saw his reapers, he called out, "The Lord be with you," and they responded, "The Lord bless you." It was more than a greeting. It was a glimpse into the heart of a man who knew that all good things come from above. But his attention was caught by a young woman he had never seen before, working quietly at the edge of his field. She moved with grace and dignity, even in the humbling work of gleaning. There was something about her that drew his eye, not just her beauty, but the way she carried herself with quiet strength. "Whose young woman is this?" he asked his foreman. "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab," the foreman replied. "She asked permission to glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers, and she has been working steadily from early morning until now with only a brief rest." Boaz watched her for a moment longer, seeing how she worked without complaining, how she was careful not to take more than was rightfully hers, how she paused to help an elderly gleaner who had dropped her grain. His heart was moved by her diligence and her kindness. He approached her quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Listen, my daughter," he said gently. "Do not go to glean in another field, and do not leave this one. Stay close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that they are reaping, and go after them. I have charged the young men not to touch you, and when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Ruth was so surprised by his kindness that she fell on her face and bowed to the ground. "Why have I found favour in your sight," she asked, "that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz had already heard the story of her loyalty to Naomi, how she had left her own people to care for her mother-in-law. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "How you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth's eyes filled with tears at his words. She had not expected such kindness from a stranger, such recognition of her small acts of faithfulness. "You have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant," she said softly, "though I am not one of your servants." As the day wore on, Boaz continued to watch over her. At mealtime, he invited her to eat with his workers, to dip her bread in the wine and share in the meal. He even made sure she had roasted grain to take home to Naomi. When she returned to her gleaning, he quietly instructed his workers to leave extra grain for her to find, to make her work easier and more fruitful. The sun was beginning to set when Ruth finally made her way home, her basket heavy with grain. She had gathered an ephah of barley, enough to feed herself and Naomi for many days. But more than that, she carried with her the memory of unexpected kindness, of a man who had seen beyond her status as a foreigner and a widow to recognize the faithfulness of her heart. When she showed Naomi all that she had gathered and told her about the kindness of Boaz, Naomi's eyes brightened for the first time in months. "Blessed be he by the Lord," she said, "whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Ruth continued to glean in the fields of Boaz throughout the barley harvest and the wheat harvest, always welcomed, always protected, always provided for. She would come home each evening with grain and with stories of the kindness she had experienced. And slowly, so slowly that neither of them noticed it happening, hope began to take root in their hearts once again. Little did they know that this was only the beginning of a story that would change not just their lives, but the course of history itself. For the God who sees every act of kindness, who remembers every sacrifice made in love, was already preparing the next chapter of their beautiful story. The harvest season was drawing to a close, and the grain had been gathered from the fields and brought to the threshing floor. It was a time of celebration and completion, when the hard work of the harvest gave way to the satisfaction of provision secured. The air was filled with the sound of winnowing, as the grain was separated from the chaff in the evening breeze. Naomi had been watching the growing affection between Ruth and Boaz with the wisdom of a woman who had lived long enough to recognize the hand of God in everyday circumstances. She had seen how Boaz's eyes followed Ruth, how he spoke to her with special gentleness, how he made sure she was always provided for and protected. And she had seen how Ruth, despite her natural reserve, had begun to smile more often, how she spoke Boaz's name with a special warmth. One evening, as they sat together in their small dwelling, Naomi took Ruth's hands in hers. "My daughter," she said softly, "should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our kinsman, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." Ruth listened carefully as Naomi explained the custom of the kinsman redeemer, how a close relative had the right and responsibility to marry a widow to preserve the family line and inheritance. It was not just about marriage, but about redemption, about restoring what had been lost, about ensuring that the names of the dead were not forgotten. "Wash therefore and anoint yourself," Naomi continued, "and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." It was a bold plan, one that required great courage and faith. Ruth would be placing herself in a vulnerable position, trusting in the character of a man she had come to respect and admire. But she had learned to trust Naomi's wisdom, and more than that, she had learned to trust the God who had been guiding her steps from the very beginning. "All that you say I will do," Ruth replied simply. As the sun set and the first stars appeared in the clear night sky, Ruth prepared herself carefully. She bathed and anointed herself with fragrant oil, then put on her best garment. But this was not about seduction or manipulation. This was about approaching a good man with dignity and respect, trusting in his honour and in the customs that governed their society. The threshing floor was a place of hard work and celebration, where the grain was separated from the chaff and the harvest was completed. By the time Ruth arrived, the work was done, and the men had eaten and drunk and told stories under the stars. The atmosphere was one of contentment and satisfaction, of work well done and provision secured. Ruth waited in the shadows, watching as Boaz finished his meal and settled down to sleep beside the heap of grain. It was his responsibility to guard the grain through the night, to ensure that nothing was stolen or damaged. The night was warm and peaceful, filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle rustle of the evening breeze. When all was quiet and Boaz was sleeping peacefully, Ruth approached with silent steps. Her heart was beating fast, but her movements were sure and deliberate. She gently uncovered his feet and lay down, then waited in the darkness for him to wake. It was midnight when Boaz stirred, suddenly aware of someone at his feet. He was startled but not afraid, turning carefully to see who was there. In the dim starlight he could make out the form of a woman, and he recognized her immediately. "Who are you?" he asked softly. "I am Ruth, your servant," she replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Spread your wing over your servant, for you are a redeemer." It was a beautiful way of asking for his protection and provision, using the imagery of a bird sheltering her young under her wing. She was asking him to fulfill the role of kinsman redeemer, to marry her and restore the inheritance of her late husband. Boaz was deeply moved by her words, by the trust she had placed in him, by the way she had approached him with such dignity and grace. "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter," he said warmly. "You have made this last kindness greater than the first in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich." He was older than Ruth, a man of substance and position, and he was amazed that she would choose him over the many young men who would have been eager to marry such a beautiful and virtuous woman. Her choice spoke of wisdom and character, of a heart that valued kindness and faithfulness over youth and passion. "And now, my daughter, do not fear," he continued. "I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I." There was another relative who had the first right of redemption, and Boaz was too honourable to proceed without giving that man the opportunity to fulfil his duty. "Remain tonight," he said gently, "and in the morning if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." Ruth lay down again at his feet, comforted by his words and his promise. She had taken a great risk in coming to him, but she had found in Boaz a man of integrity and honour, someone who would do what was right even when it was difficult. When the morning came, before anyone else was stirring, Boaz quietly measured out 6 measures of barley and helped Ruth arrange it in her cloak. "Do not go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed," he said with a smile. Then he sent her on her way before anyone could see her and misunderstand her presence there. Ruth returned home with her heart full of hope and her arms full of grain. When Naomi saw her coming, she knew immediately that something significant had happened. "How did you fare, my daughter?" she asked eagerly. Ruth told her everything that had happened, every word that had been spoken, every kindness that had been shown. When she finished, Naomi smiled with satisfaction. "Wait, my daughter," she said, "until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest but will settle the matter today." And so they waited, 2 women who had learned that sometimes the greatest acts of faith happen in the quiet moments, when we trust in the goodness of others and in the providence of God. The next chapter of their story was about to unfold, and with it the fulfillment of promises they had hardly dared to hope for. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the stones of Bethlehem when Boaz made his way to the city gate. This was where the elders gathered, where business was conducted, where legal matters were settled according to the ancient customs of Israel. His heart was full of purpose as he took his seat and waited for the other Redeemer to pass by. He didn't have to wait long. Soon he saw the man approaching, and Boaz called out to him by name. "Come over, friend, and sit down here." The man, curious about what business Boaz might have with him, came and sat down. Then Boaz gathered 10 of the city elders to serve as witnesses. What he was about to do would affect not just 2 people, but entire family lines and inheritances. "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab," Boaz began, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air, "is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, but if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." The other man considered this carefully. A piece of land was valuable, an investment that could bring profit and increase his holdings. "I will redeem it," he said confidently. But Boaz was not finished. "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Suddenly the proposition became more complicated. To marry Ruth would mean that any children born to them would be considered the heirs of her first husband, not his own. The land would eventually pass to them, not to his existing family line. What had seemed like a good business deal now became a sacrifice that would cost him more than he was willing to pay. "I cannot redeem it for myself," he said, backing away from the commitment, "lest I impair my own inheritance. You take my right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." It was exactly what Boaz had hoped to hear. According to the custom of the time, the man removed his sandal and gave it to Boaz as a sign that he was transferring his right of redemption. The sandal was a symbol of walking in someone else's place, of taking on their responsibilities and privileges. Boaz accepted the sandal and turned to address the elders and all the people who had gathered to witness this transaction. "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." The crowd erupted in celebration and blessing. "We are witnesses," they called out joyfully. "May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman. It was a beautiful blessing, invoking the names of the great matriarchs of Israel and expressing the hope that Ruth would become equally honoured in the history of God's people, and how prophetic those words would prove to be. Meanwhile, Ruth and Naomi had been waiting at home, their hearts full of anticipation and hope. When the messenger came running to tell them what had happened at the gate, they could hardly believe their ears. The legal proceedings had gone exactly as they had hoped. Boaz had redeemed not just the land, but Ruth herself, and they were to be married. The wedding was a joyous occasion, celebrated by the entire community. Ruth, the young Moabite woman who had arrived in Bethlehem as a poor widow, was now the honoured wife of one of the most respected men in the city. But more than that, she had found in Boaz a man who valued her faithfulness, who cherished her loyalty, who would love and protect her for the rest of their days. As the seasons passed, Ruth and Boaz settled into a life of contentment and purpose. Boaz was a generous provider, and Ruth was a wise and gentle wife. Naomi, no longer bitter but filled with joy, lived with them and was cared for in her old age. The house that had once echoed with sorrow now rang with laughter and love. And then came the greatest blessing of all. Ruth conceived and bore a son, a healthy, beautiful child who would be raised in the love and fear of the Lord. The women of the neighbourhood came to congratulate Naomi, saying, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." They named the child Obed, which means servant or worshipper, and Naomi took him on her lap and became his nurse. The child brought healing to her broken heart, restoration to her empty life, and joy to her golden years. But the story doesn't end there. Little Obed grew up to become the father of Jesse, who became the father of David, the great king of Israel, and through David's line would come the Messiah, the Saviour of the world. Ruth, the foreign woman who had chosen loyalty over security, faith over fear, had become part of the most important family tree in all of human history. In the genealogy of Jesus Christ, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, we find these words: Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. A Moabite woman's name is written forever in the lineage of the Son of God, a testament to the truth that God's grace knows no boundaries, that his love extends to all who seek refuge under his wings. Ruth's story teaches us that faithfulness in small things leads to blessing in great things, that loyalty and love are never wasted, that God can take our deepest sorrows and weave them into his greatest joys. She reminds us that sometimes the most profound acts of faith happen not in grand gestures, but in quiet decisions to remain faithful, to keep loving, to keep trusting, even when we cannot see the end of the story. As we come to the end of Ruth's story, let us pause beside these still waters and reflect on the gentle truths that flow through this ancient tale. Like a quiet stream that shapes the landscape over time, Ruth's life teaches us lessons that can transform our own journey of faith. Ruth's story shows us the profound power of remaining faithful, even in seasons of pain and uncertainty. When Naomi urged her to return to her people and her gods, Ruth could have chosen the easier path, the path that made sense to everyone around her. Instead, she chose love. She chose to remain loyal to a woman who had shown her kindness, to a faith that had captured her heart, to a God she was still learning to trust. Her famous words, "Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God," were not spoken in a moment of emotional impulse, but from a deep well of commitment that had been growing in her heart over years of walking with Naomi. In our own lives, we face moments when loyalty is tested, when it would be easier to walk away from relationships, commitments, or callings that have become difficult. Ruth's example reminds us that some of the most beautiful chapters of our lives are written in the ink of faithful love, even when that love costs us something precious. Have you ever chosen love when it would have been easier to walk away? Perhaps you stayed with a friend through a difficult season, remained committed to a calling when it became challenging, or continued to love someone even when they couldn't love you back in the same way. These quiet acts of loyalty are never wasted. They shape us into people of depth and character, and they often open doors to blessings we never could have imagined. One of the most beautiful aspects of Ruth's story is how rarely God's name is mentioned, yet his presence is evident in every chapter. The phrase, "as it happened," appears when Ruth comes to Boaz's field, but we understand that this was no accident. It was divine providence working through ordinary circumstances to bring about extraordinary results. God's guidance in Ruth's life came not through burning bushes or angelic visitations, but through the kindness of a stranger, the wisdom of a mother-in-law, and the legal proceedings at a city gate. He worked through the natural rhythms of harvest and gleaning, through cultural customs and family relationships, through the everyday decisions of people who were simply trying to do what was right. This reminds us that God's hand is often most visible in hindsight, in the moments when we look back and see how perfectly things came together, how doors opened at just the right time, how people entered our lives precisely when we needed them most. The God who numbers our days and knows our needs is constantly at work in the ordinary moments of our lives, weaving together circumstances and relationships for our good and his glory. Can you see moments in your own life where something just happened at the perfect time? Perhaps you met a lifelong friend in an unexpected place, discovered an opportunity through a chance conversation, or found help arriving just when you needed it most. These are not coincidences, but glimpses of a loving God who is intimately involved in the details of our lives. Ruth's story is ultimately about transformation, about how God can take our deepest losses and weave them into his greatest purposes. She began as a young widow in a foreign land, with no prospects and no security. She was an outsider, a foreigner, someone who by all human standards had little to offer the grand story of God's people. Yet her simple acts of faithfulness, her quiet loyalty, her willingness to work humbly in the fields, positioned her to become part of the royal lineage of David and ultimately of Jesus Christ. Her name is recorded forever in the genealogy of the Messiah, a testament to the truth that no one is too small, too foreign, or too broken to be used by God for his purposes. Ruth's transformation from widow to wife, from foreigner to family member, from poverty to provision, reminds us that our current circumstances do not define our future possibilities. The God who saw potential in a Moabite gleaner sees potential in each of us, regardless of our background, our mistakes, or our limitations. No matter where you come from, no matter what losses you have experienced, no matter how ordinary your life may seem, your story can become part of something bigger. Your faithfulness in small things, your acts of love and loyalty, your willingness to trust God even when you cannot see the whole picture. These are the threads that God uses to weave his magnificent tapestry of grace. Perhaps you are in a season of loss right now, wondering if your pain has any purpose, if your faithfulness matters, if your small acts of love make any difference. Ruth's story whispers hope into those questions. It reminds us that God wastes nothing, that he can bring beauty from ashes, that he specializes in writing stories of redemption and restoration. The title of Ruth's story, Beside Still Waters, comes from the 23rd Psalm, where David writes about the Good Shepherd, who leads his sheep beside still waters and restores their souls. Ruth's life exemplifies this truth. In the midst of chaos and uncertainty, she found peace in her commitment to love and faithfulness. In the midst of loss and grief, she discovered that God's provision was always enough for each day. Her story teaches us that peace is not the absence of problems, but the presence of God in our problems. It's not found in perfect circumstances, but in perfect trust. Ruth faced real challenges, real losses, real fears, but she faced them with a spirit of quiet faith and humble obedience. The still waters of God's peace are available to us in every season of life. They flow not from our circumstances, but from our relationship with the one who is the source of all peace. When we, like Ruth, choose to trust in God's goodness, even when we cannot see his plan, when we choose to remain faithful even when the path is unclear, we find ourselves beside still waters where our souls can be restored. As you drift toward rest tonight, may you carry with you the gentle strength of Ruth's example. May you know that even in quiet places, even in fields of sorrow, even in long roads and sleepless nights, grace is never far away. The God who saw Ruth's faithfulness, who provided for her needs, who wove her story into his greater plan, is the same God who sees you tonight. Your acts of loyalty may seem small, but they matter. Your faithfulness in ordinary moments is building something beautiful. Your willingness to trust when you cannot see the whole picture is positioning you for blessings you cannot yet imagine. Rest now in the peace that comes from knowing you are held by a love that will never let you go, guided by a wisdom that sees the end from the beginning, and called into a story that is bigger and more beautiful than you can possibly imagine. May you sleep beside still waters, where your soul can be restored, your strength can be renewed, and your hope can be refreshed for whatever tomorrow may bring. The God who led Ruth from loss to legacy, from sorrow to joy, from emptiness to fullness is leading you too, and his plans for you are good. Sweet dreams, dear friend. May you wake tomorrow with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are deeply loved, perfectly guided, and part of a story that extends far beyond what you can see. Like Ruth, who could never have imagined that her simple decision to stay loyal to Naomi would lead to her becoming the great-grandmother of King David, you too are part of a tapestry being woven by hands far wiser than your own. Your faithfulness today, your love tomorrow, your trust in the unseen God who walks beside you, these are the threads that he is using to create something beautiful, something lasting, something that will echo through generations. Rest now in the shadow of his wings, knowing that you are safe, you are seen, and you are more precious than you know. The same God who led Ruth beside still waters is leading you too, and his love will never fail. Amen. Hello, dear friends, and welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I hope your day has been filled with blessings and peace. Whether it's morning where you are, the quiet of afternoon, or the gentle embrace of evening, know that you are exactly where God wants you to be in this moment. I'm curious about where in this beautiful world you're listening from tonight. Are you nestled in your bed in a bustling city, or perhaps finding solace in the countryside under a canopy of stars? Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, you are welcomed here with open arms. If this story touches your heart tonight, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber. We gather here regularly to explore the profound truths and timeless wisdom found in God's Word, bringing comfort to weary souls and strength to troubled hearts. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these sacred stories that remind us of God's unfailing love and faithfulness. Now let us journey together to ancient Israel, to a time when kingdoms stood at crossroads, when truth was a dangerous commodity, and when one man's courage would echo through the ages. This is the story of Micaiah, the forgotten prophet who dared to stand alone. The sun blazed mercilessly over the ancient city of Samaria, its golden rays dancing across the limestone walls of King Ahab's palace. Within those walls, power brooked no opposition, and truth was often the first casualty of political ambition. It had been 3 years since the last war between Israel and Syria, 3 years of uneasy peace that sat heavy on King Ahab's shoulders like an ill-fitting crown. Ahab paced the marble floors of his throne room, his royal robes rustling with each agitated step. The king of Israel was a man consumed by his desires, a ruler who had long ago traded his soul to the altar of self-interest. His marriage to the foreign princess Jezebel had brought prosperity to his kingdom, but at a cost that would echo through generations. The worship of Baal had infiltrated the very heart of Israel, and the prophets of the Lord had been hunted, killed, or driven into hiding. Yet today something stirred within Ahab's ambitious heart. News had arrived that morning of Syrian movements near Ramoth-Gilead, a strategic city that had once belonged to Israel, but now languished under enemy control. The city's location made it a prize worth fighting for, a gateway that could secure trade routes and strengthen his kingdom's eastern border. As Ahab contemplated this opportunity, word came that King Jehoshaphat of Judah was approaching Samaria with a considerable entourage. Jehoshaphat was everything Ahab was not. A king who sought the Lord's face, who had torn down the high places of idol worship, and who ruled with righteousness as his compass. The irony was not lost on Ahab that he would need the help of such a man to achieve his ambitions. The great doors of the throne room swung open with a resonant boom, and Jehoshaphat entered with the dignity befitting a king of David's lineage. He was a man of medium stature but commanding presence, his beard meticulously groomed, and his eyes holding the wisdom of one who had walked closely with the Almighty. Behind him came his advisors and military commanders, their expressions respectful but cautious, as they entered the domain of Israel's controversial king. "Jehoshaphat, my brother," Ahab called out, his voice echoing through the vast chamber as he descended from his throne. "Welcome to Samaria. Your presence brings honour to my house." The two kings embraced in the customary greeting, though those who knew them well could sense the underlying tension. Jehoshaphat had come seeking alliance, but his heart was troubled by what such an alliance might require of him. "Ahab," Jehoshaphat replied warmly, though his eyes remained watchful. "It has been too long since we have spoken face to face. The Lord has blessed both our kingdoms with peace these past years." "Indeed," Ahab agreed, gesturing toward the laden tables his servants had prepared. "Come, let us feast together and speak of matters that concern us both." The banquet that followed was a spectacle of royal excess. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, exotic fruits, and wine from the finest vineyards. Musicians played softly in the background, while servants moved like shadows, attending to every need. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, both kings harboured their own purposes. As the evening wore on and the wine loosened tongues, Ahab finally revealed his true intention. Leaning toward Jehoshaphat with the conspiratorial air of old friends, he spoke in measured tones. "My brother, there is a matter that weighs heavily upon my heart," Ahab began, his eyes glinting in the torchlight. "You know that Ramoth-Gilead belongs to us, yet it remains in the hands of the king of Syria. Should we not take back what is rightfully ours?" Jehoshaphat set down his goblet carefully, his expression growing thoughtful. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that Ahab rarely extended hospitality without purpose. The question hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implication. "Ramoth-Gilead has indeed been a source of contention," Jehoshaphat replied diplomatically. "What do you propose?" Ahab's smile was that of a merchant who senses a favourable negotiation. "I propose that we go up together against Ramoth-Gilead. Your army combined with mine would be formidable. We could restore the city to Israel and share in the glory of victory." The words were carefully chosen, appealing to both practical strategy and Jehoshaphat's sense of brotherhood among the tribes of Israel. Yet Jehoshaphat had not survived as king by making hasty decisions. His reign had been marked by careful consultation with the Lord, and he would not abandon that practice now. "I am as you are," Jehoshaphat responded slowly. "My people as your people, my horses as your horses. If the Lord wills it, we shall stand together in battle." He paused, his next words carrying the weight of true conviction. "But first let us inquire of the Lord." Ahab's smile faltered slightly. In his eagerness for military glory, he had hoped to avoid the complications that divine consultation might bring. Yet he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request from a potential ally, especially one whose righteousness was renowned throughout the region. "Of course," Ahab agreed, though his tone lacked enthusiasm. "Let us seek the word of the Lord." What followed was a demonstration of the spiritual corruption that had infected Ahab's court. The king summoned his prophets, all 400 of them, men who wore the garments of holiness, but whose hearts served earthly masters. They came in a great procession, their robes flowing and their voices raised in what appeared to be spiritual fervour. These were not true prophets of the Lord, though they claimed his name. They were court prophets, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended upon telling the king what he wished to hear. Their prophecies were crafted not in the secret place of prayer, but in the calculating chambers of political expediency. As the prophets assembled in the courtyard before the two kings, their spokesman stepped forward. His name was Zedekiah, son of Chenaanah, a man whose pride matched his ambition, and whose hatred for true prophets would soon be revealed in violent fashion. "Hear the word of the Lord," Zedekiah proclaimed, his voice carrying across the courtyard with theatrical intensity. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." The 400 prophets took up the cry with orchestrated precision, their voices creating a chorus of false assurance. "Go up to Ramoth-Gilead and prosper. The Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." Some of the prophets had even prepared visual aids for their performance. They danced and shouted, waving swords and spears, creating a spectacle that would have been impressive to any observer unfamiliar with the ways of true prophecy. The din was tremendous, the enthusiasm seemingly genuine, and the message exactly what Ahab longed to hear. Yet as Jehoshaphat watched this display, his spirit grew troubled. Something about the performance felt hollow, manufactured. These men spoke with one voice, but it was not the voice of the Lord that Jehoshaphat knew from his own times of prayer and seeking. There was no cost to their prophecy, no challenge to the king's desires, no hint of the divine complexity that marked true encounters with the Almighty. As the prophets continued their enthusiastic proclamations, Jehoshaphat raised his hand for silence. The courtyard gradually quieted, though the echo of their shouts seemed to linger in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "Is there not here a prophet of the Lord besides these?" Jehoshaphat asked carefully, "that we might inquire of him?" The question fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of discomfort through the assembly. Ahab's face darkened, and several of the court prophets exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew there was indeed another prophet, one whose very existence was a thorn in the flesh of everyone present. Ahab's response came through gritted teeth, his voice barely concealing his irritation. "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord, but I hate him, for he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." The honesty of Ahab's admission was startling in its nakedness. Here was a king openly declaring his hatred for a prophet based not on any moral failing or false prophecy, but simply because the man refused to tell him what he wanted to hear. It was a moment that revealed the true spiritual state of Israel's leadership. Jehoshaphat, ever the diplomat, sought to smooth over the awkward moment. "Let not the king say such things," he replied gently, though his words carried a subtle rebuke. Ahab realized he had revealed too much of his heart. With visible effort he composed himself and called for one of his officers. "Bring Micaiah the son of Imlah quickly," he commanded, though his tone suggested he would rather summon a plague upon his house. As the officer hurried away on his grim errand, the two kings settled in to wait. The 400 prophets remained in the courtyard, their earlier enthusiasm now tempered by the knowledge that their unanimous voice was about to be challenged by a single man they both feared and despised. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and in the distance the sound of the officer's horse could be heard galloping toward the place where truth dwelt in isolation, where a forgotten prophet waited in the shadows of his integrity. The horse's hooves struck the dusty road with rhythmic precision as the king's officer rode toward the humble dwelling where Micaiah made his home. The prophet lived simply, far from the luxury of the royal court, in a stone house that spoke of function rather than ostentation. Here, away from the corrupting influence of political power, dwelt a man who had chosen faithfulness over favour, truth over comfort. Micaiah, son of Imlah, was not an imposing figure by earthly standards. Of average height and lean build, he bore the weathered appearance of one who had walked through many storms. His beard was streaked with silver, and his eyes held the deep weariness of a man who had spoken unpopular truths for too many years. Yet there was something unbreakable in his demeanour, a quality that suggested he had found his anchor in something far stronger than human approval. When the king's messenger arrived, Micaiah was in his garden, tending to the vegetables that provided much of his sustenance. The prophet lived modestly, supported by the occasional gifts of those few souls who still valued truth above comfort. He had long ago learned to find contentment in simple things, the satisfaction of honest work, the peace of prayer, and the quiet joy of communion with the Almighty. "Micaiah," the officer called out as he dismounted, "the king commands your presence immediately." The prophet looked up from his work, unsurprised. He had sensed in recent days that the Lord was preparing him for something significant. His prayers had been marked by an unusual intensity, and his dreams had been filled with visions he did not yet fully understand. "Very well," Micaiah replied simply, setting aside his tools. "Let me wash and prepare myself." As Micaiah went about the task of making himself presentable for the royal court, the officer felt compelled to share information that might save the prophet from making a costly mistake. The man had witnessed what happened to those who crossed King Ahab, and despite his loyalty to the crown, he possessed enough humanity to feel concern for this solitary figure. "Listen to me, Micaiah," the officer said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone. "The words of the prophets declare good to the king with one mouth. Let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak favourably." It was well-intentioned advice, offered by a man who understood the political realities of Ahab's court. The officer had seen the 400 prophets deliver their unanimous message of victory and prosperity. He knew that Micaiah's reputation for speaking uncomfortable truths could lead to imprisonment, exile, or worse. In his mind, he was offering the prophet a lifeline, a chance to align himself with the majority and avoid the consequences of standing alone. Micaiah paused in his preparations, considering the messenger's words. The offer was clear: conform, agree with the crowd, tell the king what he wants to hear, and enjoy the benefits of royal favour. It would be so easy, so practical, so utterly reasonable by every human measure. But as Micaiah looked into the officer's earnest face, he felt the familiar stirring of the spirit within him, that unmistakable presence that had guided him through decades of faithful service. The Lord had not called him to an easy path, but he had never failed to provide strength for the journey. "As the Lord lives," Micaiah replied with quiet dignity, "whatever the Lord says to me, that I will speak." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration of absolute commitment that left no room for compromise. The officer's face showed his disappointment and concern, but he knew better than to argue further. He had delivered his warning. What the prophet did with it was beyond his control. The journey back to Samaria was made in relative silence, the officer pondering the stubborn integrity of his passenger, while Micaiah prayed and prepared his heart for whatever lay ahead. As they approached the city, the prophet could see the banners of both Israel and Judah flying from the palace walls, confirming his suspicion that this summons involved more than a routine consultation. The palace courtyard was a scene of controlled chaos when they arrived. Servants scurried about preparing for what appeared to be an important gathering, while guards stood at attention in their finest armour. The 400 prophets were still present, clustered in small groups and speaking in hushed tones. Their earlier enthusiasm had given way to a more subdued attitude, though their confidence in their message remained unshaken. As Micaiah dismounted and followed the officer toward the throne room, he could feel the weight of many eyes upon him. Some looks were curious, others hostile, and a few held the barely concealed contempt of those who viewed his independence as a personal affront. He had grown accustomed to such reactions over the years, understanding that his very presence served as an uncomfortable reminder of the spiritual compromise that permeated the court. The great doors opened before them, revealing the opulent throne room where Kings Ahab and Jehoshaphat waited. The contrast between the two rulers was immediately apparent even to a casual observer. Ahab sat upon his throne with the restless energy of a man driven by ambition, his fingers drumming impatiently on the armrest. Jehoshaphat, seated in a chair of equal honour nearby, maintained the composed dignity of one accustomed to seeking divine guidance before making important decisions. "Ah, Micaiah," Ahab said as the prophet entered, his tone carrying forced joviality that fooled no one. "At last, our final consultant arrives." Micaiah approached the throne with measured steps, neither hurrying to show deference nor dawdling to display defiance. He had learned long ago that in the presence of earthly power, his allegiance belonged to a higher authority. When he reached the appropriate distance, he bowed respectfully but not obsequiously, acknowledging the king's position without compromising his own integrity. "You summoned me, Your Majesty," Micaiah said simply, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. King Jehoshaphat studied the prophet with interest. He had heard reports of Micaiah's reputation for uncompromising honesty, and after witnessing the theatrical performance of the 400 prophets, he was eager to hear from someone who might offer a different perspective. Ahab leaned forward on his throne, his eyes fixed on the solitary figure before him. "Micaiah, shall we go to war against Ramoth-Gilead, or shall we refrain?" It was the same question that had been posed to the 400 prophets, the same inquiry that had produced such enthusiastic unanimity. Now it fell upon the shoulders of one man who stood alone, without allies or supporters, facing the combined expectation of two kings and their assembled courts. The moment stretched taut with anticipation. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something significant, though few could have predicted the drama that was about to unfold. In the silence, Micaiah felt the familiar stirring of the spirit, but what came first was not the word of the Lord, but something altogether unexpected. What happened next would be remembered and debated for generations to come. Micaiah, the prophet known for his uncompromising honesty, looked directly at King Ahab and delivered exactly the message the king wanted to hear. "Go up and prosper," Micaiah declared, his voice carrying throughout the throne room, "for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." A murmur of surprise rippled through the assembled court. The 400 prophets exchanged glances of confusion and perhaps a touch of irritation. Here was the man they had feared would contradict their unanimous verdict, and instead he was confirming their prophecy word for word. Some of them smiled with what they imagined was vindication, while others seemed puzzled by this unexpected development. But King Ahab was no fool, despite his many moral failings. He had known Micaiah for years, had heard his prophecies of judgment and warning countless times. Never once had the prophet told him what he wanted to hear. Never once had Micaiah's words aligned so perfectly with royal desires. The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the prophet's face, searching for the truth behind this suspicious compliance. There was something in Micaiah's tone, a subtle quality that suggested layers beneath the surface of his words. It was the same tone a parent might use when agreeing with a child's obviously foolish plan, allowing them to proceed while knowing full well what the consequences would be. King Jehoshaphat, too, sensed that something was amiss, though he remained silent, observing the interaction with keen interest. "How many times shall I make you swear," Ahab said slowly, his voice carrying a warning, "that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" It was a remarkable moment. Here was a king who had just received exactly the prophecy he desired, yet his own conscience convicted him that it could not be genuine. Ahab understood Micaiah well enough to know that such easy agreement was completely out of character. In demanding the truth, the king was inadvertently acknowledging that he recognized the difference between authentic prophecy and the comfortable lies he typically preferred. Micaiah stood silent for a moment, and those watching could see a visible change come over him. The sardonic expression faded from his face, replaced by the solemn countenance of one who was about to deliver a message from the throne room of heaven. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality altogether, the unmistakable authority of divine revelation. I saw all Israel scattered on the hills like sheep that have no shepherd, Micaiah began, his words falling like stones into the sudden silence. And the Lord said, "These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace." The impact of these words was immediate and devastating. The vision was clear to everyone present. Israel would be defeated, their army scattered, and their king would not return from battle. It was a prophecy of military disaster and royal death, delivered with the calm certainty of one who had seen beyond the veil of earthly circumstances. King Ahab's face flushed with anger, but beneath the rage was something that looked remarkably like fear. He turned to Jehoshaphat with the bitter satisfaction of one whose worst expectations have been confirmed. "Did I not tell you," Ahab said, his voice heavy with frustration, "that he would not prophesy good concerning me, but evil?" But Micaiah was not finished. The Spirit of the Lord had opened his eyes to see into the very council chambers of heaven, and what he had witnessed there needed to be shared, regardless of the consequences. The prophet's voice took on an even more solemn tone as he continued. "Therefore hear the word of the Lord," Micaiah declared, his words cutting through the tension in the room like a sword. "I saw the Lord sitting on his throne, and all the host of heaven standing by, on his right hand and on his left." The court fell absolutely silent. Even the most worldly and cynical among them recognized that they were hearing something extraordinary. This was not the political manoeuvring they were accustomed to, nor the comfortable reassurances of the court prophets. This was a glimpse into eternal realities, a revelation of divine purpose that transcended human understanding. "And the Lord said," Micaiah continued, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth-Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner, and another spoke in that manner. Then a spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, "I will persuade him." The Lord said to him, "In what way?" And he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The revelation was staggering in its implications. Micaiah was claiming that the Lord himself had allowed, indeed, had orchestrated, the deception that had been proclaimed by the 400 prophets. It was a divine judgment in the form of false prophecy, a spiritual trap set for a king who had repeatedly chosen lies over truth. Therefore, Micaiah concluded with inexorable logic, "Look, the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours, and the Lord has declared disaster concerning you." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person present was forced to grapple with the implications of what they had heard. The 400 prophets found themselves accused not merely of error, but of being unwitting instruments of divine deception. The kings faced the terrifying possibility that their carefully planned military campaign was actually a trap set by the Almighty himself. But the silence was short-lived. Zedekiah, the spokesman for the 400 prophets, was a man of considerable pride and ambition. He had built his reputation on his supposed connection to the divine, and Micaiah's words threatened not only his credibility but his entire worldview. The accusation that he had been deceived by a lying spirit was more than he could bear. With a roar of rage, Zedekiah strode across the throne room until he stood face to face with Micaiah. The contrast between them was striking. Zedekiah in his fine robes and carefully groomed appearance, representing the comfortable religiosity of the court, facing Micaiah in his simple garments, embodying the uncompromising voice of authentic prophecy. "Which way did the Spirit from the Lord go from me to speak to you?" Zedekiah demanded, his voice shaking with fury. It was a desperate attempt to challenge Micaiah's authority, to suggest that if anyone possessed a connection to the divine, it was surely the spokesman for 400 prophets rather than this isolated troublemaker. But before Micaiah could respond, Zedekiah's anger overwhelmed his judgment entirely. The sound of the slap echoed through the throne room like a thunderclap. Zedekiah had struck Micaiah across the face with sufficient force to stagger the prophet, leaving a red mark on his cheek that would serve as a visible reminder of what it cost to speak truth in the face of comfortable lies. The act of violence hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. No one moved or spoke, shocked by the sudden transition from theological debate to physical assault. Micaiah slowly straightened, touching his cheek where Zedekiah's hand had left its mark. When he looked up, there was no anger in his eyes, no desire for retaliation. Instead, there was a sadness that seemed to encompass not only his immediate situation, but the entire spiritual state of the nation. "Indeed," Micaiah said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone, "you shall see on that day when you go into an inner chamber to hide." It was both prophecy and promise. The day would come when Zedekiah's false confidence would crumble, when the reality of divine judgment would force him to seek shelter from the consequences of his deception. The words carried the weight of inevitable fulfillment, spoken not in anger, but with the sorrowful certainty of one who had seen the future and found it tragic. King Ahab had heard enough. The prophet's words had struck too close to uncomfortable truths, had challenged too directly the comfortable illusions upon which he had built his reign. The vision of divine deception, the prophecy of military disaster, the humiliating suggestion that his 400 prophets were unwitting instruments of judgment, all of it combined to create a rage that demanded immediate action. "Take Micaiah," the king commanded, his voice sharp with fury, "and return him to Ammon, the governor of the city, and to Joash the king's son, and say, 'Thus says the king, put this fellow in prison, and feed him with bread of affliction and water of affliction until I come in peace.'" The order was both punishment and insurance policy. By imprisoning Micaiah until his safe return from battle, Ahab was attempting to nullify the prophecy through royal decree. It was a desperate act of defiance against divine judgment, a futile attempt to bind the word of the Lord with chains and prison walls. But Micaiah was not finished. Even as the guards moved toward him, even as the shadow of imprisonment fell across his path, the prophet had one final word to speak. His voice rang out across the throne room with the clarity of absolute conviction. "If you ever return in peace, the Lord has not spoken by me." The words were a direct challenge to royal authority, a public declaration that put Micaiah's credibility as a prophet on the line. He was essentially saying that if Ahab returned safely from battle, then everyone present should conclude that Micaiah was a false prophet deserving of death. It was the ultimate expression of confidence in the word he had received from the Lord. But Micaiah was not content to let his challenge rest with the immediate audience. Looking around the throne room at the assembled courtiers, nobles and servants, he raised his voice even louder. "Mark it, all you people." It was a call to witness, an appeal to everyone present to remember this moment and test the validity of his prophecy against future events. The prophet was willing to stake everything, his reputation, his freedom, possibly his life, on the truth of what he had spoken. It was a level of certainty that transcended human confidence and entered the realm of divine assurance. As the guards seized Micaiah's arms and began to lead him away, the throne room erupted in a buzz of conversation. Some whispered among themselves about the prophet's boldness, others debated the implications of his vision, and still others tried to process the dramatic confrontation they had just witnessed. Through it all, the 400 prophets maintained their uncomfortable silence, uncertain how to respond to accusations that struck at the very heart of their prophetic claims. King Jehoshaphat watched the proceedings with deep concern. The righteous king of Judah had requested divine counsel, and what he had received was a prophecy that directly contradicted his military plans and predicted disaster for his ally. Yet something in Micaiah's bearing, some quality of authentic conviction, made it impossible to dismiss his words as the ravings of a madman or the spite of a disgruntled prophet. As Micaiah was led away, his footsteps echoing through the palace corridors, he felt no bitterness toward his captors or self-pity for his situation. He had spoken the word of the Lord faithfully, regardless of the consequences, and that obedience brought a peace that transcended his circumstances. The prison cell that awaited him might confine his body, but his spirit remained free, anchored in the unshakable certainty that he had been faithful to his calling. The cell where Micaiah was imprisoned was a far cry from the luxury of the royal court. Built of rough stone with a small barred window that provided minimal light, it was designed for punishment rather than comfort. The bread of affliction and water of affliction promised by the king proved to be exactly that. Meagre rations calculated to sustain life, while providing a constant reminder of a royal displeasure. Yet in that dark cell, Micaiah found something that had eluded him in the freedom of his simple home. Absolute clarity about his purpose and calling. Stripped of all earthly comforts and securities, he was forced to rely entirely upon his relationship with the Lord. In the long hours of solitude, he prayed not for deliverance but for continued faithfulness, not for vindication but for grace to endure whatever lay ahead. Meanwhile, preparations for war continued with increasing intensity. King Ahab threw himself into military planning with the fervour of a man trying to drown out unwelcome voices of conscience. He consulted with his generals, inspected his troops, and made elaborate arrangements for what he was determined would be a glorious victory. The prophecy of the 400 court prophets was repeated frequently, as if constant repetition could somehow make it more reliable. King Jehoshaphat, however, found himself deeply troubled by the day's events. The contrast between the theatrical unanimity of the 400 prophets and Micaiah's stark authenticity had left him with serious doubts about the wisdom of the planned campaign. Yet he had given his word to stand with Ahab, and the political implications of backing out now were significant. As the day of departure approached, Ahab made one final attempt to circumvent the prophecy that haunted his thoughts. If the word of the Lord through Micaiah was true, then King Ahab was destined to die in battle. But perhaps, the king reasoned, he could outwit divine judgment through human cleverness. "I will disguise myself and go into battle," Ahab announced to his commanders, "but you put on your robes." It was a cunning plan. By dressing as an ordinary soldier while Jehoshaphat wore royal garments, Ahab hoped to deceive the enemy about his identity and location. If the Syrians could not identify him as the king of Israel, perhaps he could survive the battle and prove Micaiah wrong. It was the kind of tactical thinking that had served Ahab well in political manoeuvring. But he was about to discover that divine judgment operates by different rules than human conflict. The morning of battle dawned clear and bright, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers across the plains surrounding Ramoth Gilead. It seemed an unlikely day for the fulfillment of prophecy, too beautiful for the tragic events that were about to unfold. The armies of Israel and Judah had assembled in impressive formation, their banners flying proudly in the morning air, their weapons gleaming in the sunlight. King Ahab, disguised as a common soldier, moved among his troops with nervous energy. His royal armour had been replaced with the simple leather and bronze of an ordinary warrior, and his distinctive crown was nowhere to be seen. To any casual observer, he appeared to be merely another commander preparing for battle, yet those closest to him could sense his underlying anxiety, the tension of a man who was trying to outrun a divine decree. King Jehoshaphat, meanwhile, wore his royal robes with obvious reluctance. The righteous king of Judah had agreed to this deception as part of their military strategy, but his conscience troubled him. The memory of Micaiah's words weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself offering frequent prayers for divine protection and guidance. The Syrian army was formidable, well-trained and confident in their ability to defend their territory. Their king had given specific instructions to his 32 chariot commanders: fight with no one small or great, but only with the king of Israel. It was a strategic decision based on the understanding that killing or capturing the enemy king would effectively end the battle and secure victory. As the two armies faced each other across the field of battle, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Horses stamped impatiently, armour creaked as soldiers shifted their weight, and commanders made final adjustments to their battle plans. In the distance, the walls of Ramoth Gilead stood as silent witness to the conflict that was about to determine its fate. The battle began with the thunderous clash of armies colliding, the sound of metal against metal mixing with the shouts of warriors and the screams of the wounded. Chariots raced across the battlefield like instruments of divine wrath, their wheels churning up clouds of dust that obscured vision and added to the chaos of combat. For a time, it seemed as though Ahab's strategy might succeed. Hidden among his soldiers, the disguised king fought with the desperation of a man who believed his life depended on remaining unrecognized. His years of military experience served him well as he wielded sword and spear with deadly efficiency. contributing to the initial success of the Israelite forces. But the Syrian chariot commanders were not easily deceived. When they spotted King Jehoshaphat in his royal robes, they immediately assumed they had found their primary target. A group of them converged on the king of Judah with deadly intent, their chariots cutting through the battle lines like ships through stormy seas. "Surely it is the king of Israel," they shouted to one another as they closed in on Jehoshaphat. The king of Judah found himself surrounded by enemy chariots, their occupants preparing to capture or kill what they believed to be their primary objective. In that moment of extreme danger, Jehoshaphat did what he had learned to do throughout his reign. He cried out to the Lord for deliverance. "Help me, O Lord," Jehoshaphat called out, his voice carrying above the din of battle. What happened next was a clear demonstration of divine intervention. As Jehoshaphat's cry reached heaven, the Lord moved the hearts of the Syrian commanders in an unexpected way. Something about the king's appearance or manner suddenly convinced them that this was not their intended target after all. "It is not the king of Israel," one of them declared, and just as quickly as they had converged upon Jehoshaphat, they turned away to search for their real quarry elsewhere on the battlefield. Meanwhile, across the chaos of combat, King Ahab continued his desperate masquerade. His disguise had served him well throughout the morning, allowing him to participate in the battle without attracting the special attention of enemy forces. For a brief moment, it seemed as though human cunning might indeed triumph over divine decree. But the Lord's purposes are not thwarted by earthly schemes, no matter how cleverly conceived. As the battle raged on, a Syrian soldier drew his bow at random, not aiming at any particular target, but simply shooting into the mass of enemy forces. It was the kind of arrow that soldiers loose when they cannot see clearly, through the dust and confusion of battle, hoping to strike something useful, but with no specific intent. The arrow flew through the air with the invisible guidance of divine providence. It passed over the heads of common soldiers, sailed between the wheels of racing chariots, and found its mark with the precision of perfect justice. The bronze point struck King Ahab between the joints of his armour, penetrating the one gap in his defences that his disguise could not protect. The king felt the arrow's impact like a thunderbolt, the sudden, sharp pain followed by the warm spread of blood across his chest. He looked down in shock to see the Syrian arrow protruding from his body, its shaft trembling with the force of impact. In that instant, Ahab understood with perfect clarity that no amount of human cleverness could circumvent the word of the Lord. "I am wounded," the king cried out to his chariot driver, his voice tight with pain and the dawning realization of his doom. "Turn around and carry me out of the battle." The chariot driver, a loyal servant who had recognized his disguised king despite the common soldier's garb, immediately began maneuvering toward the edge of the battlefield. But extricating themselves from the chaos of combat proved more difficult than anticipated. The battle had intensified throughout the day, and enemy forces blocked many of the potential escape routes. As they struggled to retreat, King Ahab's condition continued to deteriorate. The arrow had found a vital spot, and blood flowed freely from the wound despite his attempts to stanch it. Yet with grim determination, the king remained propped up in his chariot, unwilling to let his army see him fall. His presence, even in his wounded state, served to encourage the Israelite forces and maintain their fighting spirit. The battle raged from morning until evening, the outcome hanging in the balance as both sides fought with desperate intensity. But as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the blood spilled on the battlefield below, King Ahab's strength finally gave out. The disguised king who had tried to outwit divine judgment slumped forward in his chariot, his life ebbing away with each laboured breath. As word of the king's condition spread through the ranks, the cry went up that would fulfill Micaiah's prophecy with devastating accuracy. Every man to his city, and every man to his own country. The army of Israel, leaderless and demoralized, began to scatter across the hills just as the prophet had foreseen. Like sheep without a shepherd, they abandoned their positions and fled toward home, their dreams of victory dissolving into the nightmare of defeat. King Ahab died as the sun set over Ramoth Gilead, his blood pooling in the bottom of his chariot. The man who had spent his reign choosing comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths had finally encountered a reality that no amount of deception could alter. The word of the Lord, spoken through his faithful prophet, had been fulfilled to the letter. News of King Ahab's death spread quickly through the land, carried by the scattered remnants of his army and the merchants who followed military campaigns. In the palace at Samaria, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. The 400 prophets who had proclaimed certain victory found themselves facing a crisis of credibility that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his prison cell, Micaiah heard the news with a mixture of sadness and vindication. He had taken no pleasure in prophesying disaster, had felt no joy in predicting the death of his king. Yet the fulfillment of his prophecy served as a powerful reminder that the word of the Lord does not return void, regardless of how unwelcome it might be to human ears. When the guards came to release him from prison, Micaiah emerged into the daylight a changed man. His body bore the marks of his confinement. He was thinner, paler, and bore the lines of one who had endured hardship. But his spirit was unbroken, perhaps even strengthened by his ordeal. He had spoken truth in the face of overwhelming opposition, had maintained his integrity under pressure, and had been vindicated by the very events that had brought tragedy to the kingdom. The political ramifications of Ahab's death were immediate and far-reaching. His son Ahaziah ascended to the throne, inheriting a kingdom shaken by military defeat and spiritual confusion. The influence of Queen Jezebel remained strong, but the dramatic fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy had dealt a severe blow to the credibility of the Baal-worshipping establishment. Zedekiah, the false prophet who had struck Micaiah in the throne room, found himself in an impossible position. His confident predictions of victory had been thoroughly discredited, and his authority as a spokesman for the divine had been shattered. The inner chamber where he sought to hide, just as Micaiah had prophesied, became both a physical and spiritual reality as he struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of his error. The other court prophets faced similar crises of confidence. Their unanimous declaration of victory had been revealed as the lying spirit Micaiah had warned about, and their reputations lay in ruins. Some of them quietly retired from public life, while others attempted to reinvent themselves as followers of different deities. None of them could escape the uncomfortable truth that they had been deceived, and had, in turn, deceived others. King Jehoshaphat returned to Jerusalem a wiser and more cautious man. His alliance with Ahab had nearly cost him his life, and the experience had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of seeking genuine divine guidance rather than accepting comfortable confirmations of predetermined plans. The prophet Jehu, son of Hanani, met him upon his return with words of rebuke for his alliance with the ungodly king, but also with recognition that the Lord had delivered him from the consequences of his poor judgment. Throughout the kingdom, people began to reassess their understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. The dramatic contrast between the false assurances of the 400 prophets and the accurate warnings of the solitary Micaiah had provided a vivid lesson in discernment. Many began to understand that true prophecy was not measured by its popularity or its agreement with human desires, but by its faithfulness to the word and character of the Lord. Years passed, and the story of Micaiah's stand against the 400 false prophets became one of the most remembered episodes in the history of Israel. Parents told it to their children as an example of courage and integrity, while religious teachers used it to illustrate the difference between true and false prophecy. The tale grew in significance with each telling, not because it was embellished, but because its lessons proved to be timeless and universal. The first and most obvious lesson was about the cost of speaking truth. Micaiah had paid a heavy price for his faithfulness: imprisonment, isolation, and the hostility of the powerful. Yet his willingness to endure these hardships had ultimately served a greater purpose, preserving the integrity of prophetic ministry and providing a clear example of what it meant to fear God rather than man. His story became a source of encouragement for future generations of prophets and faithful believers who found themselves standing alone against popular opinion. The second lesson concerned the danger of groupthink and manufactured consensus. The 400 prophets had created an impressive display of unanimity, but their agreement had been based on political expediency rather than divine revelation. Their story served as a warning about the seductive power of majority opinion and the importance of seeking truth, even when it contradicted popular sentiment. The comfort of belonging to the crowd, they learned, was no substitute for the sometimes lonely path of authentic faith. The third lesson was perhaps the most theologically complex: the reality that God sometimes allows deception as a form of judgment. The lying spirit that had influenced the false prophets was not an independent force, but an instrument of divine justice, permitted by the Lord as part of his sovereign plan. This aspect of the story forced believers to grapple with difficult questions about the nature of divine sovereignty and human responsibility, helping them develop a more mature understanding of how God works in the world. The fourth lesson focused on the importance of discernment in spiritual matters. King Jehoshaphat's initial uneasiness with the 400 prophets had been a manifestation of spiritual discernment, a recognition that something was amiss despite the impressive display of consensus. His request for a prophet of the Lord had demonstrated the value of seeking authentic divine guidance, rather than accepting convenient confirmations of predetermined plans. The fifth lesson was about the ultimate futility of human schemes when they oppose divine purposes. King Ahab's elaborate disguise had been a clever attempt to circumvent prophecy through human ingenuity, but it had proven utterly useless against the sovereign will of the Lord. The random arrow that found its mark had served as a powerful reminder that God's purposes will be accomplished regardless of human attempts to thwart them. As the years passed and the kingdom of Israel continued its spiritual decline, the story of Micaiah took on additional significance. It became a benchmark against which other prophets and prophecies were measured, a reminder of what authentic faithfulness looked like in the face of opposition. When Elijah stood alone against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, people remembered Micaiah's solitary stand. When Jeremiah faced persecution for his unpopular messages, the example of Micaiah's courage provided encouragement and precedent. The story also served as a cautionary tale for those in positions of authority. King Ahab's admission that he hated Micaiah because the prophet never spoke favourably about him had revealed the dangerous tendency of leaders to surround themselves with yes men rather than truthful counsellors. Future kings and officials who heard the story were challenged to examine their own relationships with advisors and to consider whether they were seeking truth or merely confirmation of their existing beliefs. In the quiet of his later years, Micaiah often reflected on that pivotal day when he had stood alone before 2 kings and 400 false prophets. The physical scars from his imprisonment had faded, but the spiritual impact of his experience continued to shape his understanding of his calling and his relationship with the Lord. The prophet had learned that faithfulness was not measured by immediate results, but by obedience to divine instruction. His warning had not prevented the battle or saved King Ahab's life, but it had preserved the integrity of prophetic ministry and provided a clear demonstration of the difference between true and false revelation. Sometimes, he realized, the greatest victories were won not through changing circumstances, but through maintaining faithfulness in the midst of difficult circumstances. Micaiah had also discovered that standing alone was not the same as being alone. In his prison cell, deprived of human companionship and comfort, he had experienced a deeper intimacy with the Lord than he had ever known before. The isolation that had seemed like punishment had actually become a pathway to greater spiritual understanding and strength. He had learned that the approval of the crowd was a poor substitute for the approval of the Almighty. The prophet had come to understand that his role was not to be popular, but to be faithful, not to tell people what they wanted to hear, but to speak what the Lord had given him to say. This understanding had freed him from the burden of trying to manage people's reactions to his messages, and had allowed him to focus entirely on the sacred responsibility of accurate communication of divine truth. The peace that came from this clarity of purpose was worth more than all the royal favour he might have gained through compromise. As news of Micaiah's faithfulness spread beyond the borders of Israel, his story began to influence other nations and cultures. Foreign dignitaries who visited the kingdom often asked to hear the account of the prophet who had stood against 400 false prophets and accurately predicted the death of a king. The story became a testament to the power of truth and the importance of moral courage. inspiring people of various backgrounds to examine their own commitments to integrity and faithfulness. The story also had a profound impact on the understanding of prophecy itself. Future generations would use Micaiah's example as a standard for evaluating prophetic claims, recognizing that true prophecy was characterized by faithfulness to the Lord's character and purposes rather than by popular appeal or immediate gratification. The account helped establish criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine revelation and human manipulation disguised as spiritual authority. In the broader context of Israel's history, Micaiah's stand represented a crucial moment in the preservation of true worship and authentic faith. At a time when the kingdom was sliding towards spiritual apostasy, his unwavering commitment to truth served as a beacon of hope for those who still sought to follow the Lord with integrity. His example encouraged other faithful believers to maintain their convictions even when they seemed to be in the minority. The story of Micaiah also served as a bridge between the ministries of the earlier prophets like Elijah and later ones like Jeremiah and Ezekiel. His experience of standing alone against popular opinion and suffering for his faithfulness would be echoed in the lives of many subsequent prophets who faced similar challenges. The patterns of persecution, vindication, and ultimate triumph that characterized his story became recurring themes in the ongoing narrative of God's relationship with his people. As we reach the end of Micaiah's story, we find ourselves confronted with questions that transcend the ancient world and speak directly to our modern hearts. In an age of social media echo chambers and manufactured consensus, the prophet's example challenges us to examine our own commitment to truth and our willingness to stand alone when necessary. The 400 false prophets of Micaiah's day have their counterparts in every generation. Those who tell us what we want to hear rather than what we need to hear, who offer comfortable lies instead of challenging truths. The temptation to join the crowd, to find safety in numbers, to seek approval rather than accuracy, remains as strong today as it was in ancient Israel. Micaiah's courage reminds us that faithfulness is not a group activity, but an individual responsibility. Each of us must decide whether we will speak truth or remain silent, whether we will stand for what is right or compromise for what is convenient. The prophet's example shows us that the path of integrity is often lonely, but it is never walked alone by those who trust in the Lord. The story also challenges us to examine our own relationship with authority and our tendency to surround ourselves with people who confirm our existing beliefs rather than challenging us to grow. Like King Ahab, we may find ourselves preferring the comfort of familiar lies to the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. Micaiah's example calls us to seek out voices that speak with authenticity, rather than those that merely echo our own opinions. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Micaiah reminds us that truth has a way of prevailing in the end, even when it seems overwhelmed by opposition. The prophet's vindication did not come immediately, and it came at great personal cost, but it came nonetheless. His example encourages us to trust in the ultimate triumph of truth, and to remain faithful even when the outcome is uncertain. In our own lives, we may face moments when we are called to be like Micaiah, to stand alone against popular opinion, to speak uncomfortable truths, to choose faithfulness over favour. When those moments come, may we remember the forgotten prophet who found his courage not in the approval of men, but in the approval of his God. The story of Micaiah teaches us that true strength is not found in numbers, but in conviction, that real courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite our fears, and that lasting victory comes not from avoiding conflict, but from maintaining integrity in the midst of it. As you close your eyes tonight and drift towards sleep, may you carry with you the quiet courage of Micaiah, the man who dared to stand alone because he knew he was not truly alone. May his example inspire you to speak truth with love, to stand for what is right with humility, and to trust in the ultimate triumph of God's purposes even when the immediate circumstances seem overwhelming. In a world that often rewards conformity and punishes authenticity, may you find the strength to be like Micaiah, faithful, courageous, and true. For in the end, it is not the approval of the crowd that matters, but the approval of the one who sees all hearts and knows all truths. The forgotten prophet's story ends, but its echo continues in every heart that chooses truth over comfort, courage over convenience, and faithfulness over favour. May that echo sound clearly in your own life, guiding you toward the kind of integrity that leaves a lasting legacy long after the voices of the crowd have faded into silence. Rest well, dear friends, and may your dreams be filled with the peace that comes from knowing you serve a God who honours faithfulness, rewards courage, and never abandons those who trust in him. The story of Micaiah reminds us that in God's kingdom, standing alone with truth is always better than standing with the crowd in deception. Sleep peacefully, knowing that, like Micaiah, you're never truly alone when you walk in the light of divine truth.